Good evening, everyone, and welcome. My name is Patricia Ford. I'm the director of the Truro Library here, and it's good to see so many people tonight. It's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Bluestone to you. He's very well known in this area, and he'd attract a crowd even if he was just reading the phone book. But also
because it's half my family.
The future of this little island or sandbar we all share is, and how well we prepare for the future is of vital importance to everyone who loves this area. So I'm very glad, but not surprised to see so many people. And if I listed all of Professor Bluestone's accomplishments and honors, you'd all be mad at me because I'd be doing all the talking this evening. So I will just say that at some point in his career, he must have developed some skills in prophecy, because he seems to have the ability to see the future. He wrote about the plight of the working poor in the 70s, the consequences of corporate restructuring in the 80s, and economic polarization in the 90s. But what impresses me most is his humanity. For such an accomplished academic and someone who lives in policy and economics, he never forgets that the point of it all is to improve people's lives. And I had a notion of what someone named Professor Bluestone would be like. And I was delighted to discover this down-to-earth and very approachable man with a great sense of humor. So, thank you.
If I don't use the mic, or do you want me to use the mic? The mic would be helpful? Yes. Okay. We're going to use the mic. How's that? All right. Well, thank you, Tricia, for such a lovely introduction, and thank you for all coming out this evening. I have been a practicing...
Is the mic on?
The mic isn't on.
I think it's on. Is that better? Okay, that's better. Okay, so I have been a practicing economist for about 50 years. I did my graduate work at the University of Michigan. My wife and I grew up in Detroit. And about 2 years ago, after practicing for mostly 50 years, I woke up one morning and realized I'd screwed it all up. That while economics was important, what was even more important was demographics and demographic change, population change. And that really drives a lot of what are the most important public policies we have. Last year, a wonderful group here on the Cape Cod Young Professionals, came to our center at Northeastern University, the Kitty and Michael Dukakis Center for Urban and Regional Policy, and asked if we would do a study of the demographic trends of Cape Cod, not knowing that I actually live here in Truro. And we were very happy to do that study, and it was released earlier this year with Jay Ash, the Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, who came out here, as well as our senator from the Cape and Islands, and we have been talking about these demographics ever since. So what I want to do today, in just literally 20 or 30 minutes and then open it up for conversation, is give you an idea of the best data we have on what has been happening to the Cape over time. And I'm going to start by going back to 1790. I thought that would be a good time to start. And in fact, we can get data on the Cape. This is Barnstable County, so this doesn't include the islands. And you'll see way back in 1790, the founding of the United States of America, the Cape was home to almost a little over 17,000 people. 17,000 people in 1790. And it would rise to double that by about 1860, by the Civil War. So we had about 35,000 people living here, somewhere on the Cape, some of them in Truro, others in Brewster and Orleans, and of course Sandwich and everywhere else. And then from 1860 all the way to 1920, a period of 60 years, the population contracted on the Cape as the fishing industry declined and as people moved elsewhere in Massachusetts and other places to take advantage of the rising manufacturing sector. And so the population by 1920 was about 26,000, 27,000, not much greater than it was in 1790. And then we began to see a real growth in the Cape beginning in 1920. And you'll see the growth just take off. And then, of course, after 1960 and the completion of Route 6, the Cape grows dramatically. So that by 2000, beginning of this century, Cape Cod had the largest population in its history, about 222,000. However, that was the peak, 222,000 in 2000. We have data from 2010 census, which shows the population had already begun to shrink to about 216,000. The latest data we have is for 2012, and it continued to shrink a little bit more. So one of the things that we were most interested in is after this explosive growth in the Cape, what is happening? Why is the Cape beginning to shrink in population when the rest of the state is growing? Okay, so we took a look just between 2000 and 2010 about what demographic group, what age group was growing and what age groups were declining. Well, between 2000 and 2010, just that single decade, we lost 10% of those people who were between 0 and 24 years old. 1 out of 10 was, we had 1 out of 10 fewer. And we had a massive decline in the 25 to 44 year olds, kind of the young prime age, a loss of over a quarter of that population. In other words, there was a quarter fewer in 2010 than just in 2000. That's dramatic when you think about other change, which is 2%, 3%. This is 26%. Where was the growth? Well, it was among most of us in the room. 45 to 64, up 20%, and 65 plus up about 5%. So we're getting older faster. Okay. So we took a look at how Barnstable County compared with the whole state of Massachusetts in terms of those 25 to 44 year olds, those prime age key workers. Barnstable is down 27%, Massachusetts was down 12.5%, nationwide only 3.4%. So Massachusetts was actually losing those prime age workers, 2000 and 2010, but Barnstable County was losing them at more than twice that rate. So we also took a look at just the number of households. A household is the group of people living in a single unit of housing, a single family home, an apartment, whatever. That's a household. And we found that between 2000 and 2010, we lost over 5,700 households in which the adult was no older than 24. We lost almost 15,000 households headed by somebody 25 to 44. We gained almost 12,000, 45 to 64, as people like myself moved here, and another 2,600, 65 plus. Okay. So I then said, since I was here in Truro, what has happened to Truro? And it turns out we have data that goes back to 1900. And in 1900, the great town of Truro was home to 767 souls. 767 souls, right here. So, you know, we could fit most of them in the library. But like the rest of the Cape, it lost population very sharply between 1900 and 1930. So there were only a little over 500 people who made Truro home in 1930, right? 513. And then it grows very rapidly like the rest of the Cape, but peaks out in 2000, and again, even here in Truro, we saw a slight decline in the population of about 80 fewer people 10 years later. So again, we want to know, after this tremendous growth in the Cape and here in Truro, what's going on? Okay. Another way to look at the town of Truro is to see what ages we saw. In the year 2000, about 19% of the population was under 19 or under. It's down to 15%. The age 20 to 64, down from 64 to 61%. Look at the age 65 plus. Less than 8% in 2000. A decade later, just 10 years later, 24% of the population is over 65. Right? We become a retirement community. Okay? So, it gets worse. The Donahue Institute at the University of Massachusetts has generated data based on births and deaths and migration flows for every county in Massachusetts. And most of the counties are growing in population, but if you look at Barnstable County plus the Cape and Islands together, you'll see that we are projected to go, again, we're adding the Cape and Islands, Nantucket and Martha's Vineyard and the others, from just under 250,000 to under 220,000 by 2035. So what we've seen happening recently is a precedent for what is expected to happen over the next 20 years. So, again, we can see this population change by decade, a small annual loss between 2000 and 2010, slight gain between 2010 and 2015, and then large losses thereafter. So what we've seen as precedent appears to be something that is actually going to pick up in speed for the next 15 to 20 years. Let's take a look at Barnstable County and plus the Cape and Islands, and you can see what the population was between 2010 to 2015, about 242,000. Then it goes up slightly to 243, but by 2030 to 2035, it's down to about 222,000, which is less than what the population of Barnstable County alone was in 2000. But why is it falling? Well, natural increase has to do with births versus deaths. And you'll see between 2010 and 2015, expected loss of 6,000 fewer people due to, more deaths versus births, and then 6,600 fewer in the following 5 years, then 7,000 fewer as a result of very few births, and some of us getting older and passing away. And each 5-year period, we see a decline in just the natural increase. Most communities in America see more births than deaths. We're not seeing that. And look at net domestic migration. That is, people coming to Barnstable County and the Cape and Islands versus leaving. Not dying, leaving. Well, slight growth between 2010 and 2015, but then projected about a loss of 9,000 between now and 25 years from now, followed by a loss of 5,000, then about 2,000. So big losses projected over the next decade. Okay? So, what we see is that by 2035, if these trends continue, 35% of the population, more than 1 out of 3 residents of Cape Cod and the islands will be 65 years or older, compared with 24% today. So if you assemble the entire population of the Cape and Islands, right, in Fenway Park or something like that, every 3rd person would be over 65. Just imagine that. Okay? And it compared with 1 out of 4 in 2010. Moreover, between 2010 and 2035, every age cohort declines. Right? And of particular interest is the near absence of children of the baby boom generation, the millennials, as a secondary bulge. Not happening here, happening elsewhere. Okay? So if we have a massive outmigration from the Cape, and having young people who may have grown up here but then go on to college off the Cape but not coming back, you end up with this lack of people in their 20s and 30s as they leave. So what we wanted to do was to figure out, what does this all mean? Here we compare the Cape and Islands to the rest of the Commonwealth of Massachusetts. Everything in green or darker is a growth in population. Cape and Islands are the only place, including the Berkshires, that loses population according to these projections. So the question is why? So as I said, working with Cape Cod professionals, we were able to put together a sample of over 3,000 people who had lived on the Cape, still lived on the Cape, worked on the Cape, or no longer were living on the Cape, but at one time did. All between the ages of 25 and 44, that key demographic. We had about 2,460 who lived on the Cape and worked on the Cape. We had about 170 who lived on the Cape but commuted off the Cape to work. We had about 86 who lived off the Cape but worked on the Cape, so they came across the bridge. And we had about 300 who had left the Cape but had grown up here, all 25 to 44. And we said, we want to find out how they feel about the Cape and the Islands. How do they feel about the Cape and the Islands? So we assessed a whole range of things, but as you might imagine, if you think about it, we confirmed a lot of our priors, a lot of what we thought already. It's going to be about jobs, it's going to be about wages, it's going to be about business and educational opportunities, and it's very much going to be about housing. So we asked the question, are the salaries and wages I earn livable wages here on the Cape? Only 34% of the sample of over 3,000 agreed with it. 2/3 said, I can't earn a living wage on the Cape. My cost of living exceeds what I can earn here. We asked about opportunities for promotion in your field, whatever field that might be. Again, 2/3 said very few promotional opportunities. We asked about, are there enough jobs that require your own education or experience? Here we had, again, about 2/3 saying no, right? So we, overall, career opportunities, mentoring, and so forth, this is not seen as an area where people can make a good living wage, work in the field of their choice, and have advancement opportunities.
How would this compare with how people would answer it in another area? I mean, not 100% of people are never going to say that it's livable, right?
No. That is a very good question. We have not done this in other parts. I am sure that we would find in other parts of the state similar concerns, but not as extreme as this. There are other surveys that we have not carried out, and generally it shows about about a third of the population of 25 to 44-year-olds worry about their future jobs, worry about finding affordable housing. And that's particularly true in greater Boston, Boston, Cambridge, Somerville.
Four answers to this, they had to agree, strongly disagree, or disagree, strongly disagree?
Yeah.
There was no neither agree nor disagree?
Right, there were 4.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's,
So
you're-
the
what you're
others
saying
are
is, yeah,
disagree or strongly disagree.
2/3 are disagree.
There's no neutral
I
position.
got you.
And then we asked about housing cost burdens. We found out the median housing cost burden, that is what percentage of your income you spend on a mortgage, was 35%. HUD suggests anything over 30% is a real concern. We asked about the percent of gross income spent on rent during the year, including the off-season when rent falls, and still people told us on average they're spending more than 30% or more of their income, and in summer and in winter rent. So housing became a second problem. We then asked the important reasons that to the people who left the Cape. So we have the people who went, those 308 who left the Cape, and we asked them, why did you leave, right? And it was a broad range of results. Not enough job opportunities in my field, 215 out of the 308. Not enough higher educational opportunities, about 116 of them. So we had a significant number of people who talked about not enough job opportunities, not enough higher educational opportunities, not enough available jobs, housing costs too high. This came up out of the 308. Okay. So what it did is it kind of confirmed some suspicions that there are, first of all, some wonderful things about the Cape that people like. The natural beauty and Cape Cod lifestyle. Everybody practically said, that's why I want to stay here, if I can. They have family and friends here. It's a wonderful community. And some of them said, I do have a good job at hand that pays a living wage. So those are the people who said, I want to stay here. But what pushes you off the Cape? Well, lack of year-round jobs that pay a living wage, lack of career advancement, which many of these young people talk about, and the lack of affordable housing that exacerbates inadequate wages. So the combination of high housing costs and low wages is pretty visible. Okay? So in the end, I said I would do this very briefly because I want to have a conversation about this. We had some recommendations. One is we should call greater attention to these push factors. Lack of job opportunity, lack of affordable housing, lack of a complete set of higher education opportunities. We've been talking with Bridgewater State, wants to start more four-year programs here, which we've been endorsing. But we advocate for more polls. We should be reducing barriers to industry development. We've been working on a number of communities, including Wareham. We've been doing something with them called the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool. We need to do a much better job of economic development marketing, which we've been talking with the Governor Baker's staff about for the Cape and Islands. We've been working with Bridgewater State and other institutions to increase higher educational opportunities here, and we have to identify ways of producing more affordable housing, which, as many people in this town know, is not easy to do. We then said, okay, how do we attract people to a community? And it turns out that one of the other major studies that we've been doing at the Dukakis Center for almost 10 years now is we created something called the Economic Development Self-Assessment Tool, or EDSAT. And the idea behind it was to ask the question, particularly to municipal leaders, but also people from the business community, how well is your community positioned, your municipality, to attract business and jobs? And we based it on major surveys we did of location and site specialists whose actual job is to help firms decide where they might want to locate a new manufacturing facility or a new commercial mall or a new commercial property. We work with a group called NIOP, the National Association of Industrial and Office Properties. We work with a group called Cornet, which is the trade association of in-house location specialists. So this would be, let's say, the vice president for location decisions at the Genzyme Corporation, I happen to know, who flies all over the world deciding where the next testing lab should go or so forth. So we asked them, what matters? And based on that, we created a 220 question survey instrument called EDSAT, which we have now completed in 78 Massachusetts towns and cities, and 121 nationwide. And last year, when I was on sabbatical from Northeastern University, I was housed at the Boston Federal Reserve Bank, which has been doing a lot of work with working cities around Massachusetts. And they asked me if I would take all the data that we collected and see what most correlates between the growth in the number of establishments, I did it between 2001 and 2011, in the 50 Massachusetts municipalities we had completed as of last year, what correlated most with the success of communities in terms of attracting investment, business investment. What was fascinating is every prior I had was wrong. Many people said, well, you've got to cut your taxes. And others said, well, you have to find a way to reduce your wages. Nope. The most important factor that we found, correlation of about 0.4, which is pretty strong in a small sample like this, was the amount of economic development marketing the community does. It turns out of the 20 working cities identified by the Boston Fed, these are all older industrial cities across Massachusetts that have been deindustrialized and lost jobs. The three communities that did the best in terms of increase in the number of establishments were Chelsea, Massachusetts, where Jay Ash, the new Secretary of Housing and Economic Development, was city manager, Lawrence, Massachusetts, and Brockton, Massachusetts, right? And they had much more establishment growth percentage-wise than Cambridge or Boston. We went in and we tried to figure out why, and the first thing was they really knew how to market their communities. Jay Ash is a brilliant guy at doing this. Lawrence actually has a Chamber of Commerce that has done a very good job. The second was timeliness of approvals. In this new modern era, every company wants to get up and running as quick as possible because delays cost them money. Therefore, you have a lot of communities that have a lot of burdensome barriers to setting up a new firm. Those communities that have improved the timeliness of approvals, making it easier, not making the barriers lower, but making it easier to get over the barriers, were also very successful at bringing in benefits. The third was you need to have parking. Who thought? You have to have parking on your economic development sites. It's good to have public transit nearby so that customers, or more likely your employees, can get there. Cross-marketing turned out to be real important, which is where the business community and the municipal leaders actually work hand in hand to market the community. Low traffic congestion turned out to be important. Fast-track permitting, another form of timeliness of approval, and of course site availability. So when I've gone out to communities and said, how can we do a better job of attracting business, before they start telling me about cutting taxes, I say, there are better ways to do that. We need to publicize Cape Cod as a place to do business. We have to make it easier for companies to set up business here so that we have the jobs that the young folks need if they're going to stay here. And this is what it shows us. The second thing that we talk about is housing. Every year, the Dukakis Center at Northeastern puts out an annual housing report card for Greater Boston, basically not the Cape and Islands, because of the cost of housing. But this year and last year, we've been talking about a very special kind of housing that I've been meeting with the governor and his cabinet about, called millennial villages. And the idea is that if you really want to attract young people to and keep them in Greater Boston, or you want to attract young people and bring them to the Cape, you have to solve their housing problems. And what we know about the millennials is they are pairing up later, they're having kids later. Many of them, like our own 24-year-old son, has 3 roommates as he teaches school in the Chicago public schools. And the question is, could we build housing, including housing here on the Cape, that would be particularly attractive to young people so we can keep them here? So the new housing model, I call millennial villages. It's not that only millennials would live there, we could live there too. But it would be a range of units, from small micro units to studios and multi-bedroom apartments, focused on the 20 to 30, 40 year old, varying in affordability. Common shared space. These are not just apartments, they're villages, with lounges and laundry facilities, seminar rooms, study space, music practice rooms, workout facilities, places where people could do their art. And also places where people could start new businesses. We've seen this in other countries. My wife and I visited Barcelona, Spain a few years ago, and we stayed in a huge apartment complex in which you had 6 units. This is for young people, but we were staying there for a conference. Every 6 units each had their own, bedroom, little study area, their own bathroom. But every 6 units had a common kitchen and a common living room. And that worked beautifully in Barcelona. Could it work on Cape Cod? Right? And in many places, we could also have retail establishments which help defray the cost of the construction of these buildings. Garden areas for parties and barbecues. Here's some images of what these apartments might look like, put together by our friends at Ad Inc., one of the large architectural firms in Boston. And so we talked about what are some of the next steps that we want to take around the county. Well, one, obviously, is think about housing. But 2, let's take advantage of the changing nature of work. More and more young people are working at home. High-speed internet is therefore critical to the Cape. We need more flexible entrepreneurs. We need self-employment opportunities. And we need to create the conditions for economic development, providing available sites, cross-marketing business community municipalities, dealing with the timeliness of approvals, not just in housing, but in business, and increasing the number of local amenities we have, and then, of course, exploring new housing concepts like the Millennial Village. That's what we think we need to do. Thank you. Just very quickly. Normally, I speak for a much longer period of time, but actually, I wanted to use this as a classroom for myself, because I've been meeting with the Senate President, Stan Rosenberg. I've been meeting with the Speaker of the House, Bob DeLeo. They both know I was going to be here tonight. I just met with Governor Baker last week, and they're all asking me about what's going on in the Cape because they've seen this study. And I said, well, I'm going to come back to you with the response of the audience here and see if this resonates and if people here on the Cape think there are things we can do to revitalize the Cape so it doesn't become a retirement community, pure and simple. So now it's your turn, and I want to hear whether you think this rings true, whether you think some of these solutions make sense. But what can I take back to Governor Baker? What can I take back to Senator Wolf? And Wolf's been here. What can I take back to the legislature in terms of kind of the policies that we might want to consider? Because every other community in Massachusetts has been beating their door to the new administration asking for assistance. The Berkshires, the older cities like Lawrence, Mayor Walsh, and we have not particularly been noticed yet in the State House, and I would like to get us noticed. Way back here. Could you also tell me who you are, what you do? Your name is Bernie?
I'm retired.
Oh.
And I'm also a Bernie Sanders supporter. My question is, and this is just anecdotal stuff, is when I go to Hyannis and go to the hospital or go to the mall, I see lots of minorities, people I think that are immigrated here from Brazil. Have you looked at that, or is that a factor here?
We've taken those numbers are here. We have international, but even with the increase, and mainly during the summer, if you go into Provincetown and Stop and Shop, you'll see their Ukrainians and their folks from Jamaica and Bulgaria. The woman who served us the day was from Kazakhstan. And we have a lot of Jamaicans who come here to work during the summers, and they're on special visas. So we've had an increase, and we're a little bit more diverse. The actual year-round population of Truro is 95.8% white, as this audience might suggest. So we've taken that into account, and to some extent what has happened, and I've talked with a lot of the businesses here, they have been forced to find workers from other countries who come here in the summer because they've had a terrible time recruiting domestic U.S. citizens to work on the Cape. So it's part of this issue. And that's the way a JAM solves its problem, by going, Avi goes to Great Britain each year to find people. That's what Moby Dix does, to England and elsewhere. Stop and Shop goes through actual organizations that get people here from Eastern Europe. But that's because they cannot find a workforce that actually lives here. Yes, sir.
My name's Jim.
Convinced me that
Let's go right here and then.
Okay.
Yeah. Name? Right here, second row, yeah.
you've convinced me.
Who are you? Can you tell me who you are?
Oh, I'm Parker Small.
Hey, Parker?
You've convinced me that we've become a geriatric population, and that says to me part of the future is developing really good geriatric care.
Yes, sir.
And that is a year-round potential employment area. Up until these last few moments, you have not mentioned the seasonality issue. You alluded to distance working from home, which two of our neighbors do very successfully, which is a real potential future, but which it seems to me is the most significant employment issue that the Cape faces.
Yeah, well, obviously we have a labor shortage during the summer, and then
And a labor surplus.
and a labor surplus the rest of the year, which chases people off.
Yeah.
And particularly when they get into their 30s and 40s, when they need to have guaranteed year-round employment in order to support their families, those are the people who are leaving here. So the question is it possible to create year-round job opportunities on the Cape. Some of those are going to be in the healthcare field, some of them are going to be in occupational therapy, some of them are going to be in specialized services, financial services, legal services, accounting services, for you and me, Parker. I mean, we're going to need those services. But, and there's some hope there, but that population, even with the growth in the percentage, the decline in the overall population actually means reduced job opportunities because you have fewer customers. That's the problem.
Well, it seemed to me that one possible super simplistic solution is that as we develop our low rent housing, that it should be truly focused on people that can be of service to the geriatric community.
Amen. No, I certainly agree with that. Back here.
My name's Jim O'Leary.
Hey, Jim.
Hi. I actually have a couple of questions and a comment. My first question is, you looked specifically at the 2000 to 2010 for a lot of the data.
Right.
Did you do any data points within that decade? And the reason I'm asking is a view of 2002 would be very different than a view of 2008. And I'm wondering if the results are more tempered to, the last several years of the decade as opposed to the first 5 or 6. Because you could come up with a totally different scenario if possibly.
It would be nice to be able to follow that year by year by year. But for the most part, until we got the American Community Survey after 2005, we had to rely on the decennial census data, which is a total count, a full count of the population. So we were stuck looking at 2000 and 2010.
Okay.
Projections, however, that the Donahue Institute have made, and I've been working with projections for not the Cape and Islands from another organization called the Metropolitan Area Planning Council, rely less on individual data points like 2000 and 2010, and look more at trends in births, deaths, immigration, and domestic migration. So those future numbers where I saw the population dropping dramatically are not based on just 2000 and 2010.
Okay. My next question really applies in terms of we're 5, 6 years later now. We have a lot more experience at Truro, but we know what's happened the last 5 or 6 years regarding job stagnation. We know what's happened with the millenniums in terms of the boomerang generation that they become. They're not car owners, they're not homeowners type of thing. And so I guess my question is, as you start to look at solutions relative to this problem, I think the view from the millenniums is very, very different, and the struggles that they face are very different than even what a 2010 survey would show.
Yeah, no, I think you're right. The other thing we're hearing more and more about are the millennials who are being trapped with enormous amounts of college debt. Now, teaching at Northeastern University, we really worry about that. In fact, I just put together some data that we're using with the legislature to try and expand the 529 savings program for college students. Those kinds of things are true. We've been looking at other data not specific to the Cape for the work we do on the Greater Boston Housing Report Card, new studies we're doing on vocational education and other studies. And we are seeing what we saw 2000 to 2010 seems to be accelerating past 2010, despite the fact that the unemployment rate came down somewhat after 2008. Wages have been stagnated for 20-some years. And if you just look at rents going up like this and wages going like that, the gap of affordability has just become tremendous. Home ownership rates, according to the latest study that just came out last week from the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard, show that the home ownership rate nationwide is now back to what it was in 1995, 20 years ago. It had gone up, and then the crash, and it's come down, and it's continuing to fall every year. And that's particularly true because 20 to 44-year-olds are either deferring home purchases or choosing not to purchase at all.
And then just a quick comment, if I may, on the young professionals and attracting young professionals. You know, as you noted, the Cape is a beautiful place, and, you know, that would, so I think the more that you deal relative to the internet, in terms of, forget about the brick and mortar,
Right.
but in terms of, you know, if you can solve the housing problem, the millenniums more and more work out of wherever they live, sort of thing. And, you know, the beauty of the Cape and the seasonality of the Cape would be real drawing cards. If, you know, would you rather work here or there, sort of thing, if you could have your job, and if you could have two jobs, which is the important part, because whether they're married or single, they're usually paired up at some point. So you need two jobs, so you need to figure out the way to get two very diverse jobs in the same household.
Exactly. But again, you put your finger on it, and I come back to the affordable housing problem. And the problem we have in one community after another, including our own here in Truro, is the difficulty of getting, you know, town meeting support for expanding affordable housing options. Now, I think this is going to be a serious problem for those of us of my generation, because the more and more we get to the point we're on fixed incomes, but the cost of our public services continue to rise, including adding public services for us, the less we're going to have to rely on younger people paying the bill, and the more we're going to have to raise our taxes on fixed incomes. And so bringing young people here to help, you know, carry the freight for public services is actually going to be critical to our own well-being. And so I've been telling people here, you're cutting your own throats by opposing affordable housing, because if we can't get those young people here, you're going to be paying more taxes. And it's going to be more difficult for you to pay those taxes 10 years from now than today. Yes, sir.
Hi, Stan Siegel. You know my son Ben.
Do indeed.
And I like.
We live 100 yards apart.
We never get together though.
No. Well, you're here tonight.
I want to play the devil advocate.
Okay.
I feel we have a problem with public relations and attitude among the people living in the Outer Cape. And the reason is that most of us, and I wouldn't mind having a show of hands, don't want changes in this area. We Stop and Shop tried to get in here at one time, and there were protests. And my problem is, if we can get publicly, to get the elder people like myself to believe that we can benefit by bringing in elements of industry and making this area affordable for everybody, not just for seniors. This is the real problem in Truro and the Outer Cape. We don't want changes. We like it the way it is.
Yeah.
We don't want industry here.
See, my answer to that is that change is inevitable. The question is whether we react to that change in a way that the change is beneficial. So we're seeing, for example, I'm just completing some work on Boston. Boston is losing its entire working class. It still has lots of poor people because it has subsidized housing. And of course, we're putting up tons of luxury housing starting at, $3, $4, $5 million per condo. We just have our first condo, which is going to sell for over $35 million on the waterfront, right? And it's going to go to a Russian or a Brazilian, I'm sure. But change is inevitable. The real question is, how do you guide change in a way that is beneficial for the whole population here? And I would submit that the data that I've seen here shows dramatic change, but not necessarily the kind of change we're going to be very happy with when we look out 3, 5, 10 years from now. And so being able to say, what are the things we need to do about housing, about attracting industry here, having more young people, not less young people here. Those are the kinds of things we have to confront, and it means many of the things that we have been reticent about, like affordable housing, I think we have to take another very close look. Tricia?
Well, I just wanted to take this opportunity to share some successes with you.
Great.
Up in North Truro, right along the road here, there's several entrepreneurs of young people.
Yeah.
The new Chiquesset Chocolate
Yeah.
is a young couple. Salty Market's a young couple.
Right.
And yesterday I was at the farmer's market, and there's a lot of young families doing, making herbs,
Yeah.
growing herbs and selling them, a lot of farming going on in Truro. So it's, they may not be numerically significant, but they're here. And there's another man who just opened a card store, he moved from Wealthy, where there's no drive-up, walking by traffic here. But he's confident that he'll do well because he does most of his selling online.
Right.
So, and the affordable housing that connects to the library here, whoever chose the site, I think was a genius, because the library and the rec is so close to them. We have 3 or 4 families that come to the library almost daily.
Yeah.
You know, it's been such a great fit for it. And the families that are up there, you know, it's yoga teachers, it's people that work for the towns, it's, you know, there's a writer up there. It's been a real great addition to the town, I believe.
And right next to Chiquesset Chocolate is this new little restaurant. I mean, we were just there the other day. Remember the name?
It's not new, it is a moved restaurant, it used to be in Provincetown.
Yeah.
It was called Tips and Topsin for many, many years in Provincetown,
Right.
and they moved.
And it's down Palms.
Tips
Captain's
and
Choice.
Topsin on Bradford Street.
And there's a couple of food trucks around,
Yeah.
which I think is a
And Truro
wonderful
Vineyards,
thing.
I mean, doing very well. No, I don't want to say that it's all black, that it's all dark. No, there's some, but there's way too little of it.
Yeah.
And the question is how do you encourage more young people like those young folks to say, I've got a shot at making it here in Cape Cod? Yes.
Just to, I'm sorry that I burst in about Tips and Topsin.
No, thank you.
But I know somebody who's working there. I live in Provincetown. I don't actually see, I don't know if a show of hands would help, but is anybody here from Provincetown except me? Okay, hi guys. We are talking about this on our Provincetown community space every day in every way, and it is a serious, serious problem. I think that it's important just to give Stan a reason to be a little bit less fearful. Optimistic would be, I don't want to go all the way to optimistic. I think what industry is happening now for millennials and people younger than millennials is not industry in the way that we know it. It's not polluting steel workers or even fishing. You know, even the smells and sights and sounds of a fishing community, it's not even that. It's a different kind of industry. Now it has its own problems because it's a work for hire industry like Uber and other things that are a very sort of a free form without benefits necessarily or without much structure. But I think that may make it a more attractive, it may make it easier to come out to a more isolated place. I think transportation out here is a huge problem. I am from New York, and New York City, and I am not used to a place that in the wintertime you can't get a bus for 4 hours. I mean, that is not a great situation and doesn't augur well to bringing in more young people who would want to be doing something without the expense of a car, without the expense of a mortgage. So yes, encouraging rental housing and the whole affordable housing versus community housing versus what those words can sometimes signify, instead of signifying a place where you want to sign a lease for 3 or 4 or 5 years and live at a reasonable rent, not buy the luxury condo, although of course Provincetown and other places on the Cape have their own version of that. And that's a serious, serious problem. It will keep people away, will continue to keep people away. But it's happening in New York and it's happening in Boston. It is so true. It is the hollowing out of a middle class. You have poor people and very wealthy people, and then nothing in between. And it's a terrible situation.
Much better said than I could. I'm going to go back here. Yes, sir.
Just a
Who are you?
comment or two. The people that you're talking about that need this affordable housing, to begin with, the bulk of them are in deep debt to begin with, which is one of the major problems, and that's why they can't afford conventional housing. And that's why they're shying away from it, and they're looking for apartments and, other things.
Exactly.
Right, but
And that's everywhere. That's not just here.
that's
everywhere.
right. But even more so here. And the only other comment I will make is that your affordable housing model, it reminded me of my graduate dorm at the University of Connecticut from 1956 to 1959.
Did you enjoy it? Did you enjoy living in that dorm?
Yes, as a graduate student, I got my PhD from UConn.
There you go.
It was
Yeah,
fun.
we need to do some more like that. In fact, the model that I've been talking with Mayor Walsh about in Boston is to actually have a coalition of new architects who have some great ideas about how to do this, including panelized construction and training young workers in how to do new forms of housing. Private developers, both for-profit and non-profit, the construction trades, the building trades, the construction firms, the finance agencies, and the university presidents and the CEOs of the major teaching hospitals all working together to develop this kind of housing. And I can say this because I've got tenure at Northeastern and they can't fire me. I would love to see Northeastern commit to working with developers to put that kind of housing up for their own graduate students
I remember,
and take master leases.
I remember UConn, if you were a married graduate student, you put your name on the list and you got into a graduate school apartment.
Yes.
Which was supplemented by the university. Of course, I was, collecting a salary for being a graduate assistant and so on. But, what you're talking about is not unreasonable.
I hope not. What do you get your PhD in?
Chemistry.
Okay, back here.
Dan Lewis, and I'm an architect from Centerville. And I can talk to some of this, especially as far as regulations. They're crazy. They're absolutely nuts. What was 20 years ago, the building code was about that big. Now it's 3 books, each one bigger than the original, with then amendments and amendments to the amendments, and then references to other books and other manuals. Then of the, I think it's 352 cities and towns, each one is different. They all have their own little set of boards. They have a planning board, zoning board of appeals, conservation commission, fire department. Each one of them is protecting their own little piece. Some of the city and towns have gotten better. Well, they'll get everybody together in one room and we can try to solve it at once, because otherwise this regulation is pulling this way and that one's pulling that way, and you try to meet in the middle. The zoning regulations can be crazy, because if you try to create something that's nice, there will be specific zoning regulations that keep you from doing something that would actually be nicer. Like, for instance, if the building is set back from the street, you are not permitted to move it closer to the street and put the parking in back. When you get to, I'm from Centerville, where now the center of town, the center of the village is 1 acre zoning. If you built the village of Centerville with 1 acre zoning, nobody would like it because it's a giant subdivision. You can't build what you used to build that people like. I could go on and on. When you get to the fire departments, that when you put in a new road, they want a road wide enough so if one fire truck breaks down, you can still fit 2 around the other side of the road. It's just, if somebody has a large house and they want to put in an apartment to reduce the size of their house and be able to get a little rent and actually have somebody else that might be there when they're not there, they can't do it. I mean, it's absurd. What's a good thing is the governor is looking at this, but I think there's so many pieces of this, it's hard to get it so it all kind of makes sense again.
Well, we did actually a whole study on zoning in all 351 towns and cities 2 years ago in our Greater Housing Report Card. And, the reason for this is that towns and cities actually have very little control over their own livelihood. What they do have control over is zoning. And anything if you have very little that you have control over, you guard that zealously. But we are going to need legislation, and in fact, some of the most important legislation has actually been filed by our own Senator Dan Wolf to try and cut through some of this. But again, what we've been doing is going out to communities and saying, like we said to here today, change is going to happen. the regulations you have prevent the kind of good change you want and will give us bad change. And you have to recognize that because most people don't put those pieces of the puzzle together. Over here.
Hi, Barry. Carl Brotman. I'm have the hard job of creating affordable housing here in Truro as the chair of the Housing Authority. And how can I phrase this? You haven't talked so much about the second home market. It is in Truro 70% of our housing. A lot drives that, and we have, you know, we're right up there with Weston and Lincoln, Mass, and Wellesley, and so on in terms of median house values. We have an extraordinarily high group of wealthy homeowners, and also a number of people who have invested in a home, as I did, as a rental property for many years, and hoped someday to own it, and hoped someday to retire into it, which I have. It's a diverse group of housing expectations. It obviously influences the character of the town, and in a funny way, as you were talking, I was thinking, well, if you extend out, we cannot have so many healthcare people to help with the older people who want to retire here, and we don't have so many worker bees to run our community. Do we have a housing bubble? Can you imagine someday where our home prices will look not so good because, in fact, the community that supports them now, which is probably adequate to support them now, might not have the characteristics that folks want, either for retirement or as an investment?
Very interesting question, because last year I did a piece for Banker and Tradesman, which is a magazine that does a lot on real estate, newspaper. And the question I raised was, we started seeing single-family housing prices rise from the depths of the Great Crash, Great Recession. And the question was, do we expect to see another housing bubble in single-family homes? And my answer was, no way. This is not going to happen even in Massachusetts, probably even in the rich suburbs of Boston. And it's certainly going to happen nationwide. And the reason is, we have more single-family homes today nationwide than we're ever going to need, given older population who will be at some point moving out of those houses, and a small generation of people who can afford to move into them. Nationwide, the Joint Center for Housing Studies at Harvard estimates that by 2030, there'll be 4 million vacant single-family homes nationwide. And we've probably seen the peak. I've actually checked Zillow, and I've checked my own housing value. We live on Unionfield Road, right here. And our housing value peaked in 2007. It's down probably about 15% since then. And I think part of it is, I always thought that, you know, younger baby boomers following me would want to come out here and get that second home. But that's not happening in anywhere near the numbers. And so I would expect that we've probably seen, we're not going to see that much more appreciation in single-family homes, and probably will see a decline in the value of those homes over the next 15 years. This younger generation is not going to be able to buy us out, including our own children.
I might just say, apropos of that, Gary, that our latest numbers are that of the 527 or 26 last home sales in Truro, 7% of them were for year-round homes.
7%.
Yeah.
Oh, that's so
7%. Over here.
Yes, I'm Jean McKnight, and I almost raised my hand in response to who's from Provincetown, because I worked for so many years for the town of Provincetown, as well as other Cape Cod towns, as an attorney with the law firm Kopelman and Page, which represents so many Cape Cod towns as town council. And in response to your question about what can the state do to encourage year-round development of enterprises that will employ people, it occurs to me that water and sewer infrastructure is very badly needed on Cape Cod. But it's very tricky, and because it is such a fragile environment, and particularly with regard to the water supply. So you look at Provincetown, I think Provincetown is a real model for developing a wastewater disposal system that was low growth, no growth. And in fact, I think Provincetown's Special Act is very much mirrored in a part of the general laws that got adopted in the past 10 years as a model. And the idea is this, you're going to put in the new sewer system, or even the new water system, although that's a new idea, you know, as you hear me out, but you can only get a permit to connect to it if you already need it, you know, you already are failing your well or your sewer, or your establishment is going to provide year-round housing or year-round employment. And if not, if it's just seasonal, sorry, you have to wait. You know, we really probably won't have enough capacity for you. It's an idea. It was used in Provincetown, and I think successfully. And of course, why wouldn't they just have super growth in Provincetown? Well, because there's the water supply. You know, you have that problem all throughout the case, the fragility of the environment. Another thing, though, is why the state involvement? Because you've got your townspeople going to town meeting and voting. Do we want to borrow money for this water supply or this sewage disposal system? And there's a lot of nervousness about that. Who's going to pay for that? It's going to raise our taxes, or there's going to be betterments. If you had special state grants, specially geared to the problems that you identified for the Cape, but also respecting the fragility of the environment and using the permitting in that way, I think that might help, and I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
I think that's important. I want to just go back to one of my graphs here, if I can. Because one of the questions you might ask is, can the Cape afford more population? Right? It's so fragile. And the point I was making before, if we get here, almost there, is it's not a question of the growth of the Cape. The question is, could we stabilize our population? And the answer is, that's going to take a lot of work, because by 2035, according to this, we're going to lose about 25 to 30,000 people on the Cape. You're talking an average of, you know, losing about 10 to 12,000 households. So I'm not worried about overtaxing the environmental capacity. I am concerned about losing population, particularly since that loss is of young people. So, you know, we're going to need to think about how we deal with water. Decades ago, I remember going to town meeting when we were battling over whether Provincetown would be able to use our transfer station. I nearly lost every friend in Truro when I did an analysis of that for the town. But that's really, that graph more than anything else calls attention to the issue we face. That plus knowing the age change. Anybody else who hasn't said something? Let's go here and then we'll come back to you.
My name is Bill Goodbody. I live in Truro.
Hi, Bill.
I'm interested in, one is something I can agree with that you said in the beginning, and that is the coordination of activities among different groups. And then you mentioned the internet, which is one of my interested parts, both in Truro and on the Cape. The Cape got about $50 million to build what is really a state-of-the-art internet backbone from Provincetown, going to Brockton and now Boston, and to Providence, and the little thing, with the idea that this could be connected, let's say, it's not no Bank of Boston anymore, but State Street Bank decided they're going to build a big facility somewhere down here and have people work from here instead of commuting to Boston, and they need a lot of internet capacity. It's already in place.
Right.
The problem is, I don't think any of that's happened. At the time when it first got started, when they were about to turn it on, they started a thing called Smarter Partnership. People were involved in it. They talked about a lot of different possibilities among the towns, the libraries, all kinds of places that were automatically connected, including one strand of fiber that goes all the way down North Camet Road and sits up on a telephone pole because nobody ever figured the next piece of the puzzle. But more importantly, that's
We
a small
put that in when Vice President Gore visited.
I know it was.
Not South.
North Camet Road.
Yes, not South Bend. It won't come on South Bend.
Yes, they will, but that's another issue. There's a different issue between Comcast and, this Open Cape built quite a system on the Cape.
Yeah.
But it's what's called a middle mile system, and needs to connect to something big. And none of the pieces of the puzzle were originally in place to make the common systems that the town could supply, like online building permitting.
Right.
I mean, it was just, it still is a nightmare, in my opinion.
Yeah.
And it's because none of that has been done, yet the state put up at least $5 million for it. The federal government put up $40 million, and the county put up a big chunk too.
Well, the data I showed you on like economic development, marketing, timeliness of approvals as being so important. The fact is there's some real simple fixes to those things. Like some of the communities we've been working with have as many boards as Truro has, as Wellfleet has, but they allow developers to come in and make one presentation to all the boards on one night, rather than 8 separate presentations. Other communities have been saying that we will guarantee an answer to whether you can develop in our town within 60 days from your application. And we guarantee that. And that is having a tremendous effect in some of these communities. I've seen it in places that I didn't think could get any business, like Lawrence and Chelsea. They're now doing it in Framingham, I think. So those kinds of things are real important. And then the economic development marketing comes in. With the new technology, and I mentioned that in one of my slides, we have some opportunities of doing particularly work that's heavily dependent on the internet and high-speed communications. We now have the backbone to do that. I can spend much more time here than in Boston because I do all of my research, literally all of my research here in Truro. And I'm in contact with my staff back in Boston every day, many times during the day, and we just send files back and forth and we work on it. So it makes it possible for me to do something that I couldn't do 5 years ago or 10 years ago. And very few people know about that.
I suspect all of that's done with private internet service.
Oh, it's Comcast. Yeah, that's
And a
right.
lot of people think, I mean, I'm not a fan of Comcast.
None of us are.
They have on the other hand, basic infrastructure that's out on the outer Cape is highly advanced.
Yeah. And we just haven't taken advantage of it, but it's a selling point that very few people know. Ray?
My name is Ray Ellman. I lived here for 40 years and now I don't. But
he's a young millennial who no longer.
But one of the points you made, and you've repeated a few times, is the issue of marketing. And I started thinking about how that really has an impact. And I moved here in 1970 when I was 25 years old. I didn't know a single person. And I came in September as the winter was approaching because I reasoned that this would be a cheap place to live in the wintertime. And what I discovered was there were 300 other people who thought exactly like me. And when I called the flotsam of the flower child age, sort of washed ashore in Provincetown. And we started theater groups, and we started, I ran something called the To Be Coffee House, where entrees were 50 cents and soup was 25 cents. And everybody started something.
Ray, was that the restaurant in which every last item was brown?
Right, that's the same thing. So the point is that a lot of people became industrious, found ways to live here because, like, the first place I rented was $75 a month for a single family house on Lookout Bluff in, behind Terra Luna. So we created kind of a community here that made us all want to stay up to a point where a lot of us started going back and forth to make a living elsewhere. And the point you're making about marketing is what's the attractiveness of millennials wanting to be here? If you were marketing the lifestyle that's here and saying what the possibilities are if people banded together and formed internet companies or formed various kinds of organizations and got involved with creating housing, I think there's something that could be marketed that way. So for example, right now, I'm involved with an organization that does digital marketing, and our workforce is all over the world. We have people in China, we have people in Bosnia, we have people in Dubai, and everybody's just using the internet, and we use Skype and we see each other, and so there's no reason that can't be happening here. So it's not the issue of whether or not you could actually start these businesses here. It's why would somebody want to leave a millennial who maybe is excited by an urban lifestyle? An urban lifestyle. Why would they want to be in a more isolated lifestyle? And so you have to promote the values of what it's like to be here in the winter, which are still exciting. Lee and I loved being here in the winter when we did it.
Not last winter.
Back here.
I'm Jay Vivian. I live in Truro also. I work with Carl with affordable housing, but mostly I do nonprofit municipal employee retirement investing. But you're looking for things to take back. I have 3 specifics for you. One is if the state has access to state land that is not being used, release that for use for affordable housing.
Absolutely.
So that's something to be brought back. A second thing is that...
By the way, we have been working with DCAM, which is the Department of
Capital Assets.
Community Asset or something like that.
Capital
And
Assets
we're
and planning.
identifying every parcel of state-owned land in the Commonwealth as
that'd be good.
potential for housing.
Second, we have strong kudos for the CITC, the tax credit that's being given to development corporations,
Right.
which gives people more than a 50% tax credit, not a tax deduction, tax credit. So, and I know several people in here that have done that. We've done that. Yeah, it's really a great benefit. So look into it, but pass back that's good. And the third is we need to do more regionalization, and we could use some more support from that. Because as someone, I think maybe it was you said, people fight to give up the last thing that they have the holdover. Mm-hmm. So even for something like police dispatch, which I know you're not even supposed to talk about in Truro, but it's a really smart thing to regionalize that if you can solve the paper road problem. There's a lot of regionalization things that we need to do. Some of it is the code consolidation. Because you're right, I mean, you move 5 miles and the electric code is different and the zoning code is different and the Conservation Commission is different so we need to fix that, and I think we need some help from the state on that because I don't think the towns are ever going to solve that.
Those are all exceptional suggestions, and I will take them back.
An example of a local win, or at least win in progress. And that is, as our fishing industry is declining, the aquaculture development area, 25 acres in Provincetown, 25 acres in Truro, and considering expanding Truro to 50 acres of deep water, subtidal growth of shellfish, oysters, clams, mussels, bringing the fishermen that have lost their jobs because of the restrictions on fishing back into a world that they know and love, and experimenting with whether you can grow oysters faster on the surface or down deep. And if you can grow them deep, leave them all winter. All these kinds of things are currently going on in Provincetown and Truro.
This is great news.
And one question.
And we just need more and more of that kind of entrepreneurial, innovative activity.
Yes. One question. You told us about the various communities and what they had to offer. How much of their success depended on their PR salesmanship, and how much depended on what they actually had to offer?
Chelsea was almost exclusively due to their city manager. I worked with him for years, Jay Ash. Nobody wanted to go to Chelsea. Chelsea was the rag trade. Chelsea burned down twice. The last time was in the 70s, and the whole city burned down. And he did a magnificent job of 7 days a week talking about Chelsea. and he finally got some hotels. There are now 5 hotels in Chelsea that are serving the Boston market. They've been bringing in other industry, but it is a municipal official who understood what Ray was talking about, the importance of marketing. You've had the same thing in some of the other communities that have done very well. Now again, I didn't expect this at all because I didn't go through a school of management. I'm an economist. So I don't think about marketing per se. But I was surprised at how important it is because here's the way it works. Most of the larger firms, not the smaller firms, use these location specialists to find them a new location. Most of these location specialists have no idea where Truro is, and they certainly didn't know where Chelsea is. What the marketing does is it alerts them to this. The story I like to tell is a parallel to this. So I'm at Northeastern University, a very successful private university, and we now have more young people applying to Northeastern University than any other university in America. Last year we had 53,000 young people apply for 2,800 freshman spots. So I went to the vice president. We have a senior vice president for enrollment management. And I said to Philly, you know, quite frankly, how the hell do we review 53,000 applications? I remember when our son applied to college and, you know, all the sweat put into the SAT scores and the essays and letters of recommendation. How do you review all this? He said, well, as a matter of fact, we hire hundreds of temps. And we've got the same ones coming back every year, so they have a pretty good idea of it. And what we tell them is, we just want you to go quickly through each one of these and say yes or no. Yes meaning to be further considered by the professional staff at Northeastern's enrollment management, nay, throw it away. And if you don't get through that, you're gone, no matter how. So I said to Philly, how long, on average, does one of these temps review a single application? 6 minutes. So you have 6 minutes to impress.
For the 12 hours of work?
For the 12 hours you've got, or 50 hours of work, or 100 hours of work. You know, I took 2 hours just to write the letters of recommendation, right? And so I said, well, what do they look at? She says they look at the SAT score, Scholastic Aptitude Test score. They look at the grade point in high school. They look at the grade rank. And they read the first paragraph of your essay. So if you fail in convincing them in the first paragraph of your essay, no matter how good the rest is, you're gone. And what it reminded me was this critical, and they use a term for this, is that they all carry what they call cognitive maps around in their heads. So they have a cognitive map, if they know a community, of what Detroit is, where I grew up. They have a cognitive map of Boston. They have a cognitive map of Kendall Square, Cambridge. Most of them have no cognitive map of Truro, or Wellfleet, or Orleans. They don't know. Getting them to recognize this community even exists is the first step. Then, working on the regulations, working on the zoning, working on all these other things, you get them to recognize that this is a pretty damn good community that's interested in the kind of appropriate development for that community that will help that community. And all of a sudden, they're talking to 3 or 4 of their employers, which are firms, and saying, you know, you're going to be doing this internet startup or expansion of the internet. You really should consider the Cape. It's a very, very good place. People who work there are, you know, you've got communities that want to help you set up operations here. And so forth. So those cognitive maps become really, really important. And, you know, our problem, I think, on the Cape is that most people think of this as simply a vacation area, that it has no infrastructure, it has nothing that would appeal to the development of any kind of business. And we have to change that impression so that the cognitive maps that these location specialists carry around in their heads are changed. And that's why what Ray was saying, I think, is so important.
I'd like to bring this up, the Park Service.
The Park Service.
We have 70% of the land is owned by the Federal Park Service.
Here in Truro.
in Truro, and they are not in the housing business, as you know. They have a lot of dilapidated homes that I understand the county is going to destroy a few of them. But my question is, to you, is that why, even if it takes an act of Congress, and it would, if the great senators and representatives supported us, like in Quincy, like it happened in Quincy, where land was given to the city for housing and for development, because the Park Service doesn't have the money. They don't know what to do with all the land that they have taken from us. And I would really like to see someone try to get endorsement by the senators and the representatives through Congress to give us, for $1, as much land as we could have, for not only for housing, but for development and for some of the things that you are talking about.
And we would need a tiny, tiny fraction of the parkland to create the kind of housing we need.
That's right.
And that's the kind of thing that Elizabeth Warren, Senator Markey, and Bill Keating, our congressman, should be working on. And what you want to do is to get somebody from HUD, the Department of Housing and Urban Development, going over to talk to somebody in the Department of Interior and saying, hey, let's think about this.
They're very political, right?
Yeah. Back here.
Kathy Sullivan, I'm from Truro, raised in Chelsea, so I know what happens.
Right.
And I just had a question. You know, we're preaching to the choir. Obviously, all of us here are people who love this. You know, we love Cape Cod. We're moving towards our elderly years, and we enjoy the comforts of what it gives us. But I have a question. How do you market to get companies here to the Cape, or, you know, because if we build it, you'll come. Low-income housing, affordable childcare, whatever it is. So once you're here, what's there to work? I mean, what, you know,
right.
You need to make money. So, I mean, and just one example I have is I know that the Cape Cod Hospital and the Falmouth Hospital is all you have. If there's an accident anywhere in the vicinity, you're airlifted at about $17,000 to $20,000 to a Boston hospital for care. Is there any competition that we can get in this area, and what other type of, you know, industry can we? And by the way, my whole life I worked in telecommunications, so I'm very aware of the internet.
Well, I think number one, we're going to need a lot more services for us as we get older. And that's not just health services. It's legal services, it's financial services, it's a whole lot of services we need. It's transportation services. I keep telling people, I love to drive, I'm from Detroit, but you do not want me on Route 6 when I'm 85. Right? But how do I get around? You know? And we don't have a transportation system that's working. I've been talking in Boston about creating what I call Ubers for elders. You know, we have Uber, you need Ubers for elders. And we're going to need, I'm talking with Seti Warren, the mayor of Newton, about how we can do transportation in Newton. So I think we have a bit of a chicken and egg problem. Firms are going to go to communities where there is a good labor market, where there are people who want work. And of course, people are going to go to markets where there are good businesses. So we need to work on both attracting young people here and attracting businesses. And a large part of it is attracting young people who are starting their own businesses, as we've seen in your comments. Because the average business, as you were saying, is not a steel mill. It's a firm with 7 employees that is doing some innovative new thing using the high speed of electronics. And that's what we need to.
And when you talk to some of these younger people, well, I have not younger kids. I have a daughter who runs the recreation program here in Truro, and 2 sons. One of them is a friend of Evan's, but they all talk about wanting to live here year-round, finding jobs where they could work remote. you know, some of them started businesses. I have a son that worked for a technology company in Boston, and he's trying to go off on his own. So they want to come here, but it's difficult. We can't afford it, so they don't leave. But
Right.
how do you, you know?
Well, I think that's what I've been saying. We have to create an environment where young people can come here, that they can live in affordable housing, that they have opportunities, use the technology and use what we have here to be able to start businesses. And it starts, I mean, it's a complex problem, but it starts with solving some pretty basic problems. And I would argue that one of those very basic problems is just the affordability of the Cape, particularly because you have to spend so much of your income on housing if you want to live here year-round, including, you know, June, July, and August. And those are the kinds of things we have to solve. Maybe time for one more questions?
Well, I just had a comment that I'm really enthusiastic about your idea of the millennial housing, and I think it would be so perfect here, tied in with the dune shack aesthetic, the mid-century aesthetic, you know, that sort of European, sort of small footprint living would be, I think it would be a wonderful fit here in Cape Cod.
And we have very good evidence that that's what kids want.
Yes.
That's what young people want. You know, it's interesting, in Greater Boston, we've been talking about it, not just to provide housing for young people so we can keep them there. What the young people are doing, I think we all know in the room, is 2, 3, or 4 of them, again, as my son has done, get together, and they outbid a working family for a traditional triple-decker, right? The housing we built between 1870 and 1920 to accommodate wave after wave of immigrants. And that housing stock was perfectly built for the young immigrant family who was maybe here for 4 or 5 years, got a piece of the rock, was able to purchase a fairly inexpensive triple-decker and rent out 2 units to their neighbors or friends or family. 40% of the housing stock in Greater Boston, I should say inner core of Boston, Boston, Somerville, and Cambridge, are triple-deckers and duplexes. Since 2009, the average price of buying a triple-decker has gone up by 85%. And the reason is because they can capitalize that into the rents by being able, instead of renting to a family that can afford $1,200 for a 3-bedroom triple-decker, they get 4 kids each paying $800 each. And it's just, I mean, we have friends who are investing in triple-deckers because, you know, particularly after this week in the stock market, triple-deckers are a gold mine. But I want to get the kids out of there and turn that older housing stock back to working families, so we don't have the missing middle that you were talking about, and yet have housing that is so exciting for young people that they'd rather be here than Brooklyn, San Francisco, or Denver, Colorado. Thank you very much.